Good evening and welcome to Boring History to Sleep By. Tonight, we'll drift quietly through centuries of stories, some strange, some unsettling, and many deeply familiar. We'll be exploring how women's emotions, especially fear, sadness, and anxiety, were once misunderstood, misdiagnosed, and often treated with everything except kindness. So, before we begin, I invite you to settle in. Find a comfortable position. Let your shoulders drop. Let your jaw unclench. If you'd like, let me know in the comments, what time is it where you are? And where in the world are you listening tonight? It's always comforting to know that somewhere out there, someone else is listening too, maybe getting sleepy right along with you. And if you enjoy these slow journeys through time, please follow the channel. That way, whenever you need a quiet companion to unwind, you'll know exactly where to find us. Now, take a deep breath. Let your day go. And let's go back, not just decades, but centuries, to a time when a woman's silence was seen as strength, and her anxiety was treated as a problem to be solved, not a story to be heard. Let's begin, slowly, in ancient Greece. A place of towering philosophers, sun-drenched temples, and wildly confident medical guesses. Now imagine, you're a woman in, say, 430 BCE. And for the past few weeks, something has just felt off. Your chest tightens unexpectedly. Your heart races even when nothing's happening. You can't sleep. You're shaky, restless, maybe even weepy, though of course you'd never admit that too loudly. Because emotions, as we'll soon learn, were very poorly received. So you go see a healer. He's a man, naturally, with a well-oiled beard and a tone of voice that says, "I've definitely got this, even though I absolutely don't." After a few moments of dramatic chin stroking, a lot of Hermes and as, he gives you the diagnosis: your uterus is on the move. Yes. Apparently, your womb has grown bored. Or perhaps lonely. So it's taken off in search of a better location inside your body. Maybe up near your lungs. Maybe down toward your knees. Like a rogue Airbnb guest with no sense of boundaries. They called it hysteria, from the Greek word hystera, meaning womb. The idea was simple, if completely incorrect. Women's bodies were inherently unstable, and their uterus could spontaneously roam about, causing symptoms like breathlessness, fainting, anxiety, and even seizures. The solution? A sort of scent-based hostage negotiation. The healer would waft pleasant smells near your pelvis, lavender, rose, maybe some cinnamon bark, while simultaneously holding something putrid under your nose. Spoiled eggs. Burning hair. Garlic cooked past the point of decency. All in an effort to lure the womb back down to where it belonged, like a cat with a superiority complex. No one, of course, asked how you were feeling. No one considered that perhaps you were overwhelmed. Or grieving. Or, just human. And the idea that your symptoms might be rooted in emotion or circumstance. That would take another 2,000 years to catch on. Because in this time and place, women were property. Silence was virtue. And anything inconvenient, be it panic or pain, was blamed on your uterus going rogue. Still, they were trying, in their own very misguided way. There were no brain scans. No knowledge of the nervous system. No trauma-informed care. Just a world trying to explain human emotion without any of the vocabulary to describe it. It's almost charming, if it weren't so tragic. Now we drift, slowly, gently, into ancient Rome. The empire of aqueducts, togas, and an absolutely unshakable confidence in their own brilliance. You might expect that, by now, things would have improved for anxious women. You'd be wrong. In fact, if you were a woman in Rome feeling overwhelmed, tearful, or even a little too introspective, your options were limited. There were no therapists to call. No yoga retreats in Tuscany. And certainly no mental health podcasts hosted by sensitive men named Marcus. Instead, you'd be diagnosed with a furor uterinus. Which, yes, does sound like either a Roman battle tactic or a really dramatic opera. But it actually translates to rage of the uterus. That same wandering organ theory stuck around like a bad dinner guest, except now, it had become agitated. Apparently, your womb wasn't just curious anymore. It was throwing a fit. The cure? marriage. And childbirth, preferably both. Quickly. You see, the medical consensus, and by consensus, we mean the opinion of men who had never once menstruated, was that women became unstable when they weren't fulfilling their natural destiny. Which, conveniently, involved raising children and staying quiet at dinner. And if you were wealthy, you might be given the deluxe treatment, a glass of wine, some gentle harp music, and a strong suggestion to take a husband and relax. If you were poor, well, you'd likely be ignored altogether, or handed a pouch of herbs by a market woman who smelled like goats and had 3 teeth. And heaven help you if you grieved too long, or cried in public, or questioned your husband. That kind of behavior could get you labeled not just hysterical, but dangerous. Maybe even possessed. Cue the priest. Cue the bone rattling. Cue the shame. Because Roman society, brilliant engineers though they were, still hadn't quite engineered compassion. They built roads, aqueducts, legal codes, but not a single safe space for a woman's fear. And so, once again, her sorrow was repackaged as weakness. Her panic rebranded as failure. And her story, like so many others, remained untold. Now we tiptoe into the Middle Ages. A time of knights and castles, and also, fleas, famine, and deeply questionable medical theories. If you were a woman back then, and you felt the slow squeeze of dread in your chest, or tears that came out of nowhere, or dreams that left you waking in panic, you might have been terrified to say a word. Because in this era, anxiety wasn't seen as a symptom. It was seen as a sin, and a particularly suspicious one. You see, medicine had largely taken a back seat. The church was in charge now. And when it came to mental health, their go-to explanation was simple. If you were trembling, weeping, or overwhelmed, it probably meant the devil was renting space in your soul. There were monasteries and nuns who tried, earnestly, to help. But without any real understanding of the mind, help often looked like isolation, or fasting, or days and days of silent prayer beside a cold stone wall. Nothing says emotional support like a diet of bread crusts and Latin chants. The wandering womb theory hadn't entirely disappeared, but now, it came with extra spice, demons, divine punishment, and the occasional accusation of witchcraft. Because if you were too sad, or too loud, or too herbal, that might mean you were cavorting with Satan. Or just, not very ladylike, either way, dangerous. And if your neighbors were feeling especially righteous, you could be dragged to a trial. Not one with lawyers, but the kind where someone ties a rock to your ankle and throws you in a river to see if you float. Float? You're guilty. Sink? You're innocent, and also dead. So, you know, win-win. And yet, even in the midst of this fear-soaked era, women kept feeling, kept weeping, kept waking in the night with breath they couldn't catch. They didn't have the words for panic attacks or trauma, but they knew what it felt like to be scared and alone, to have no one ask, "What's wrong?" Only, "What did you do?" And while today we might cringe at their suffering, maybe we've carried more of it with us than we'd like to admit. Because even now, many still whisper their fears in secret. Still feel shame for their tears. Still wonder if something inside them is wrong. But it's not. It never was. Welcome to the Renaissance. Art is flourishing. Science is blooming. Michelangelo is busy carving David, and Leonardo da Vinci is sketching helicopters hundreds of years before they'd actually fly. It's a golden age of reason and beauty and rediscovery. Well, mostly. Because when it came to understanding women's mental health, things were still firmly stuck in the mud. Possibly with a leech attached. You see, while thinkers were mapping the stars and dissecting cadavers, most doctors were still consulting ancient texts and coming to the same tired conclusion. If a woman was anxious, sad, or tearful, the culprit was probably her uterus. Again. Apparently, it was still misbehaving. And the cure? Balance, which sounds nice. Until you realize what balance meant in Renaissance medicine. It meant bloodletting, cupping, a few friendly leeches to the temple. Or maybe, for a more elegant touch, a poultice of hot herbs placed gently on your abdomen while you quietly questioned your will to live. And if you were lucky enough to be born into a noble household, your treatment might involve being sent to the countryside. For fresh air and rest. Which actually meant, no books, no visitors, no opinions. Just long walks supervised by a maid and a daily herbal tonic brewed by someone who once read half a paragraph of Galen. Feeling better yet? Of course not, because no one was asking how you felt. They were just trying to make sure you didn't disturb the household with your inconvenient emotions. Women who cried too much were locked away behind velvet curtains. Those who didn't cry enough? Watched carefully, in case they exploded. And while men were praised for their intellect and creative angst, women were expected to sit still, smile softly, and not let their nerves ruin the aesthetic. This was an age that gave us symphonies and sonnets. But when it came to a woman's fear, it offered silence. Or lavender oil. Or a leech. It's a bit like walking into a 5-star spa, and being treated by someone with a meat cleaver and a handwritten copy of Aristotle. So yes, progress was happening. Just not for everyone. The 17th and 18th centuries, the world is having a bit of a glow-up. Newton is figuring out gravity. Voltaire is penning essays about reason and liberty. And over in some dimly lit clinic, a doctor is still trying to figure out why women keep feeling things. Welcome to the Enlightenment, the age of logic, liberty, and a brand new way to misunderstand women's anxiety. Now, to be fair, there was some progress. The wandering womb theory had finally wandered off. Instead, doctors began focusing on something new. Nerves. Specifically, too many of them. Women, it was said, were delicate, oversensitive, prone to nervous complaints. Which, to be clear, was just a fancier way of saying, she's upset and we don't know why. It must be her biology. They even gave it a name, nervous sensibility. It sounded polite, almost elegant. But underneath the powdered language was the same old story. Women who trembled, panicked, cried, or felt too much were labeled as unstable, and gently nudged toward remedies like warm milk, lavender sachets, and a long lie down in a dark room. And if that didn't work? Opium. Because nothing says trust the science like tranquilizing someone until they stop talking. If you were upper class, you might be packed off to a rest cure at a peaceful estate, where you could stare into the distance while someone read the Psalms nearby. If you were poor, well, you just had to get on with it. Anxiety wasn't considered something to be understood. It was something to be managed, quietly, and without disrupting the men who were busy inventing democracy. And here's where the irony really kicks in. This was the age of the social contract, the rights of man, the dignity of the individual. Unless that individual was a woman having a panic attack, then it was, maybe she should marry. Or eat less pork. Enlightened, indeed. And so the pattern continued. Female pain, noticed, named, but never really heard. In a world obsessed with rational thought, women's fear was still irrational. Emotional. Troublesome. But hey, at least they stopped waving garlic under your nose. That's progress, right? Ah, the Victorian era. Everything looks so elegant on the surface. Lace gloves, high collars, and drawing room decor so stiff it makes a dining chair look rebellious. But underneath the velvet and corsets? A society just bursting at the seams with silent panic. And nowhere was that panic more carefully managed, or more carefully ignored, than inside the minds of women. Now, Victorian doctors were very concerned with women's mental health. Not in a let's listen and support kind of way. More of a let's put her in a padded room until she stops scaring the guests kind of way. Women who experienced what we'd now call anxiety were typically diagnosed with something called nervous exhaustion, or simply, hysteria. That catch-all label again. The same one used for sadness, anger, fear, indigestion, boredom, or the radical act of asking questions during dinner. And the cure? The now infamous rest cure. Prescribed especially for women who were overstimulated by the pressures of thinking, reading, creating, or heaven forbid, wanting a life outside the home. Picture this, a woman curled in bed for weeks, no reading, no writing, no talking, no walking. Just lying still, like a very polite hostage in a four-poster prison. The idea was simple, eliminate all activity and emotion until she becomes calm again. Or silent. Or both. Now, to be clear, this treatment didn't just not work. It often made things worse. Famous author Charlotte Perkins Gilman was given the rest cure. She followed the instructions to the letter, and nearly lost her mind in the process. Instead of healing, she wrote The Yellow Wallpaper, a now classic tale of a woman descending into madness while trapped in a room with, you guessed it, yellow wallpaper. And yet doctors continued to prescribe it. Because nothing says science-based treatment like locking someone in a room until they agree to feel better. Meanwhile, Victorian society was obsessed with appearances. A woman's job was to be pleasant, graceful, serene. If she failed at that, if she broke down, lashed out, or simply cried too often, she might be gently escorted to an asylum, where treatments included cold water dousing, electroshock, and being restrained for days at a time. But the real punishment? Silence. No one asked why she was struggling. No one asked if she'd lost a child, or suffered violence, or felt suffocated by the rigid expectations of her role. They just assumed she was unstable, unfit, unwomanly. And so, women wept behind heavy curtains, numbed by sedatives, shut away from the polite world. They were never heard, only treated. Treated as problems. Treated as burdens. Treated, but never listened to. And through it all, the narrative remained the same. If a woman couldn't smile through her suffering, she was ill. If she couldn't stay quiet, she was mad. And if she tried to explain, well, let's not make a scene. Ah yes, the early 1900s. Corsets were loosening. Industrial cities were booming. And a man named Sigmund Freud was about to make everything your father's fault. Welcome to the dawn of psychoanalysis, where your dreams had meaning, your fears had origins, and your every thought could be traced back to something deeply symbolic, or deeply Freudian. Now to his credit, Freud did offer something radical for the time. Instead of dunking anxious women in cold water, or feeding them laudanum until they forgot their own names, he invited them to talk. Lie down on a couch. Close your eyes. Speak freely. It was revolutionary. Until it wasn't. Because while Freud listened, he also interpreted. And more often than not, his interpretations involved suppressed sexual desire, unresolved childhood trauma, or, surprise, your subconscious resentment toward your mother, or your father, or both. According to Freud, if a woman had anxiety, it wasn't because she was overwhelmed, or unsupported, or quietly imploding under the weight of being expected to smile while the world slowly crushed her. No. It was because she had repressed feelings about, well, pretty much everything. Terrified to leave the house? Definitely symbolic. Recurring nightmares? Probably a metaphor for your wound. Again, panic attacks? Almost certainly linked to something phallic. And thus began the age of analysis. Women poured their hearts out in smoky Viennese rooms while men with mustache took notes and nodded solemnly. They spoke of fear, of sadness, of rage they couldn't name. And the doctors told them it was all in their head. Which, ironically, it was. But not the way they meant. You see, instead of asking what had happened to these women, Freud and his followers asked what was wrong with them. Their theories weren't built around compassion. They were built around pathology. Emotion was evidence. Distress was dysfunction. And healing? Well, healing came through the acceptance that you were broken, and that the man in the chair with the notepad could fix you. But even this flawed step forward was, strangely, progress. Because for the first time in centuries, a woman's emotional pain wasn't being treated with garlic smoke or exorcisms. It was being heard. Sort of. And even though the explanations were drenched in gender bias, at least there were conversations happening. Still, it would take another few decades before the world started asking a more radical question. What if she's not broken? What if she's just human? Which brings us to, welcome to the 1950s. The war was over. The lawns were trimmed. The casserole was in the oven. And the emotional lives of women? Buttoned up tighter than a Sunday blouse. This was the era of the ideal housewife, a smiling figure in heels, vacuuming shag carpet, perfectly content with her lot in life. Or at least, that's what the advertisements wanted you to believe. Behind the polished countertops and pastel kitchens was a very different story. Because many of those smiling women were quietly unraveling. Lonely, bored, restless, drowning in expectation. But instead of asking why, doctors handed them mother's little helper. Valium. Miltown. Tranquilizers were so common they were practically part of the breakfast menu. Feeling overwhelmed? Take a pill. Feeling numb? Take two. Want to scream into the void because your entire identity has been reduced to laundry and potato salad? Shish, don't talk like that. Here, have a sedative. Doctors weren't asking about meaning or purpose or isolation. They weren't asking if maybe being expected to raise perfect children, run a flawless home, maintain a trim figure, and be sexually available at all times might be a lot. Instead, they diagnosed nerves and offered chemical compliance. But let's be clear, women weren't depressed because they were hormonal. They were depressed because they were trapped. Trapped in homes they couldn't afford alone. In marriages they couldn't leave. In lives they weren't allowed to question. And if they did question, they were told they were ungrateful. Because didn't they have everything? A nice home, a husband with a job, children, appliances, a dog. Why on earth would they be anxious? Which, of course, made the anxiety worse. And so the silence deepened. Women learned not to ask for more, not to name their sadness, not to admit that sometimes, at night, when everyone else was asleep, they wondered if this was all there would ever be. So they took the pills. They smiled through the fog. And they told themselves it was just a phase. But something was shifting. A whisper at first. Then a murmur. Then a movement. And that's where we're headed next. By the time the 1960s arrived, something was crackling under the surface. The casseroles were still warm. The houses were still spotless. The smiles were still applied each morning like lipstick. But behind those polite hellos and PTA meetings, women were starting to whisper, and the whispers all sounded strangely alike. Is it just me? Why do I feel so empty? Is this all I get? That quiet ache, the one Valium hadn't fixed, finally got a name. The problem that has no name. Betty Friedan wrote those words in The Feminine Mystique, and it was like someone flung open a window. Suddenly, women realized they weren't crazy. They were just suffocating. Not from illness, but from expectation. They were expected to be happy, beautiful, serene, selfless. All while suppressing their ambitions, shelving their intelligence, and smiling through the soul-crushing boredom of folding towels for the third time that day. And if you dared say out loud, "I want more," you were accused of being unfeminine, unstable, or, heaven forbid, political. But many women were done whispering. They started attending consciousness-raising groups. They passed around books and cigarette packs and truth like contraband. They began noticing that their private pain was actually pretty public. The same gaslighting, the same pressure, the same quiet rage beneath the polite veneer. And let's not forget, this was before the birth control pill was widely accessible, which meant for most women, freedom wasn't just inconvenient, it was dangerous. You couldn't dream too big, you couldn't leave too fast. Because one pregnancy could change everything. So, women talked. They started connecting the dots between depression and isolation, between anxiety and powerlessness, between anger and a life lived in parentheses, not sick, not broken, just buried alive in a perfectly decorated cage. And slowly, beautifully, they began to dig their way out, not all at once, not without backlash. But they were starting to say the word that would reshape everything. No, I won't smile on demand. No, I won't accept sedation instead of support. No, I won't pretend this is enough. And with every quiet refusal, a new possibility cracked open. Point one, where women could question their roles without shame. Point one, where being anxious didn't mean you were defective, it meant you were awake. And awake women, they don't go back to sleep. Let's talk about the real power shift. And no, we're not quite at Woodstock or burning bras yet, that we're still stuck in the early 1960s, before the pill was mainstream, before Gloria Steinem was a household name, and before society realized that women could, shocker, want things. It was the era of pastel kitchens and mother knows best. If you were a woman during this time, your choices were not really yours. Marriage wasn't just a milestone, it was the default setting. Motherhood was not a question of if, but how soon. Your job wasn't a career, it was a brief, pre-marriage detour or a secret wish you carried like contraband in your purse. Your anxiety was still considered a flaw in you, not in the system designed to squeeze you into someone else's idea of perfection. However, something was starting to fray. Women were tired of the smile and swallow routine. They were tired of being told to lie down and rest instead of being listened to. They were exhausted by being told that wanting more freedom, more education, more than casseroles and cordial conversation, meant something was wrong with them. Wanting more is not a malfunction. It's a signal. It's the nervous system whispering what the world won't say out loud. You are meant for more than service and silence. Without birth control, saying yes to yourself still carried heavy consequences. One mistake, one miscalculation, one night of giving in to your own humanity, and your entire future could shift course forever. So women tiptoed. Some rebelled quietly, by reading books they weren't supposed to, by dreaming bigger than their husbands approved of, by wondering, late at night, if maybe they weren't crazy after all. Maybe they were just human. And that was the scariest, most revolutionary thought of all. Because the minute a woman realizes she's not crazy, that she's just trapped, the walls start to crack. And when the pill finally arrived, those cracks became doorways. So, the year is 1960. A small white pill enters the market, and whether anyone realized it or not, it was about to rewire the entire system. It didn't look revolutionary. It didn't come with a parade. No banner that read, "Congratulations, you now get to choose your own future." Just a little prescription, tucked into purses, whispered about in beauty parlors, slid discreetly across pharmacy counters. But make no mistake, this tiny pill was a tectonic shift. For the first time, a woman's future didn't have to be decided by her fertility. Her body wasn't a ticking clock anymore. It was hers. And that changed everything, slowly, quietly, and not without a fight. Because, of course, the backlash came. Hard. Religious leaders panicked. Politicians debated. Even doctors hesitated, gatekeeping prescriptions like women needed to pass some kind of moral test first. Are you married? Are you planning to be? Are you emotionally mature enough not to, ruin society? And all the while, women were thinking, I just want to go to school. Or get a job. Or have sex without betting the farm. Simple, really. But nothing about female autonomy was ever allowed to be simple. And while some saw the pill as freedom, others painted it as a threat, the death of morality, the unraveling of the nuclear family, the beginning of the end. To which many women thought, good. Let it end. Let the endless sacrifice end. Let the daily suppression, the carefully choreographed smiles, the quiet cries behind laundry room doors, let all of it unravel. Because maybe, just maybe, there's something better waiting on the other side of that unraveling. Something like a life of her own. A life where anxiety isn't a punishment for wanting more, but a signal that you're on the edge of becoming. And that's the beginning of a different story entirely. So here we are. The 1970s. The music's getting funkier. The jeans are getting wider. And women? Women are getting louder. Anxiety, once confined to whispers behind closed doors or silenced under the weight of polite society, starts showing up in bookstores, on talk shows, and across living room couches where consciousness-raising groups are meeting over instant coffee and feminist literature. Because something clicks in this decade. A realization that maybe, just maybe, the problem isn't her. Maybe it's the structure, the system, the expectations she never agreed to but inherited anyway. You see, women start talking. Really talking. And once the dam breaks, the water doesn't stop. They talk about the panic attacks in perfect kitchens, the numbness in carpool lines, the rage that builds quietly while folding yet another basket of color-coded laundry for a man who still thinks babysitting his own children deserves a gold star. They talk about being told it's just hormones, that they need to smile more, that maybe if they were a little less dramatic, they'd feel better. And then someone, maybe a therapist, maybe just another exhausted friend, finally asks the golden question, what if it's not you? What if it's all of this? All of this being the patriarchal double bind. The one that says, be soft, but not weak. Be sexy, but not too sexy. Be successful, but don't make anyone uncomfortable about it. By the time Betty Friedan's The Feminine Mystique is practically required reading at brunch, the term "the problem that has no name" starts to get one. And that name is anxiety. Not hysteria. Not a touch of the vapors. Actual, diagnosable, livable, breath-stealing anxiety. The kind that comes from juggling everything and still feeling like you're failing. The kind that lives in the stomach, behind the eyes, in the tightness of a chest that's tired of smiling through it. And for once, women are not being told to sit down and be grateful. They're being told, you're not alone. They're learning that maybe, just maybe, a panic attack is not a moral failing. It's the body saying, this isn't sustainable. You weren't meant to carry all of this alone. And isn't that a radical idea? That your symptoms are not a flaw, but a message. That the system is sick, not the soul inside of it. The decades roll forward. Therapy becomes more accessible, or at least, more talked about. Mental health stops being such a dirty little secret, though stigma still lingers like smoke in a room no one dares to air out. By the 80s and 90s, self-help books multiply like houseplants in sunlit kitchens. There's Prozac. There's Oprah. There's a whole new language for feelings that once had no name. And women keep searching. Through yoga classes, late-night journaling, whispered confessions, and online forums lit by the soft blue glow of early computers. They're still asking the same quiet question. Is it just me? And still discovering. No, it never was. Yes, the headlines change. Yes, the diagnoses evolve. But under it all, the core remains. A nervous system stretched thin by centuries of shifts. A mind wired to notice every need but her own. A body trying to hold the weight of generations who were told to endure in silence. But she is still here. Still showing up. Still making appointments. Still reading, still reaching, still raising daughters who might grow up hearing a different story. And that is its own kind of revolution. Not loud, not fast, but steady, like breath, like healing, like the long, quiet undoing of a very old spell. So if you're a woman and you're tired, not just tonight, but deep in your bones, that kind of tiredness that lives behind the eyes and beneath the skin, know this. You are part of a long line of women who kept going anyway, even when no one believed them, even when their pain was dressed up in prettier words and dismissed. And still, you rise. Every single day. With tenderness, with humor, with grace, even when it's messy. You carry not just your own story but the fragments of stories that came before you. And still, you try again, you love again, you breathe through it. And the world is better because you kept going. Maybe you're ready to rest now. Let yourself exhale. Let your nervous system unclench, just a little. Let your story, tonight, be enough. You don't have to carry it all, not right now. Sleep well tonight. You're not alone. You never were. And this story, your story, is still being written.